May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. There was a woman who was recently widowed who made a decision that it was time to leave her big house and move into a senior living community. So she struggled to downsize her home, and she decided she'd struggled also to accept that this was a time of her life to make this move. But she made the decision to accept that she would be living in a place for older people. She had never really been around older people much in her whole life because she had a young spirit and her parents had died young, and she just, all her friends were about 10 years younger. So when she looked in the mirror, though, she faced the reality that this is where she was now, and this was the right thing to do. And so she moved, and she decided to make a spiritual goal of learning to love old people, including herself. And it has been a heart-expanding experience for her. She connected with different groups in her new community with people who had common interests like a bridge club or a book club, and she even started a poetry circle. And recently she had the insight that when the connections happen, the walkers and the canes and the disabilities are ignored in favor of the sheer human person. When Jesus is asked, what is the great commandment of them all? He goes right to the heart of the Hebrew scriptures, to the Shema in Deuteronomy. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And then Jesus adds in the key line from the passage we read from Leviticus this morning. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. He intertwines these two commandments. The idea sounds simple. Love God, love your neighbor. But living it out is anything but. When you ask, who is God and who is my neighbor, you realize that you have to wrestle with these questions. These two commandments are central to being a believer in God. You can't love God without loving your neighbor. To ask, who is my neighbor, echoes one of the first stories in the whole Bible in Genesis, when Adam and Eve's two sons had a terrible conflict, and Cain killed Abel. And God came looking for Abel, and Cain said to God, am I my brother's keeper? I remember I was in 3rd grade when I noticed there was a new kid in my class at Haymount Elementary School, and her name was Vicky. At recess, she stood alone on the playground, and none of the other kids came up to her. They were absorbed in their groups by the monkey bars or the swing sets. So I went up to Vicky, who told me that, she was new, so was I, and she felt like an outsider. It was a child's attempt to reach out to another child. And just thinking about this story makes me realize it starts young, this loving your neighbor thing. Who is my neighbor, and how do I develop a relationship with my neighbor? There's another passage in Matthew that says, if we only love our own friends and our own family, then how are we different than from people who have no God, who do wrong in the world, who have no belief system? How does that set us apart if we just love our own friends and family? Even the wicked love their own friends and family. Well, William Temple, a great Anglican theologian, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury back in World War II, he wrote, it is not our friends that we are bidden to love, but our neighbor. A person chooses his friends, but he finds that his neighbor is provided for him. It is our relations with those chance people with whom the accidents of life have brought us into contact, which are the test of our Christian spirit. The family that lives next door with their vexatious habits and assuming manners. The impracticable partner or the incompetent subordinate. The overbearing superior, whose qualities we never pause to consider. Those with whom you share a study or a bathroom or a bedroom. These are our neighbors. It is so easy to be enthusiastic, he goes on, for good causes, and even to work hard for them. The difficulty begins with the tiresome people who always try our tempers. But it is among these that we find our Christian spirit tested. If a person can succeed in being invariably courteous and considerate in dealing with his neighbor, that person has some measure of the Spirit of Christ. So as we think about these words from William Temple, consider what it takes to get that Spirit of Christ inside of us. It means we have to try to be holier people, more like Jesus. In our first reading from Leviticus, God says, "You shall be holy. You shall be holy." The root of the word holy means to be set apart. In other words, if we are God believers, we need to trust God all the time, and that sets us apart from the rest of the world. We're different because we care about being in faithful relationship with God. And so we have to put our faith into practice. And this is where we begin, by attempting to love our neighbor, especially the neighbors we are not trained to like or accept. For example, reaching across the aisle, across political party preference, or reaching across cultural and racial lines. To love our neighbor is to ask, who lives next door to me? Am I in conversation with them? Have I extended hospitality to them? Have I waved hello or knocked on their door? Extending goodwill is often beyond our comfort zone. So perhaps we should ask, where do we get our own capacity to love? When God says, "You shall be holy," we're called to see the divinity in ourselves as well as in one another. To love ourselves enough to forgive ourselves for our terrible failures and our flaws, knowing that God already has forgiven us and still loves us despite all of our foibles. There's always so much more common humanity when we know our own strengths and weaknesses, and we know that we're still lovable. As we attempt to love our neighbors, there's always more common humanity than there is difference. So I invite us to hear the word of the Lord today. You are set apart to love those who may seem like they're unlovable. Remember how Jesus cares for the vulnerable and brings the marginalized to the center? He really loves them. He meets them where they are and brings blessing and healing into their lives. Being like Jesus, being holier, means working on increasing our capacity to intentionally love our neighbors, old and young. And this is how we build community, like here at Trinity, where we can offer resiliency and hope to each other in a pandemic time. Our new program, Invite, Welcome, Connect, is really a manifestation of loving our neighbor. So just to conclude, like the widow, when she moved to the senior community, she made a decision to love her neighbors. To love one's neighbors requires a decision to love. Loving our neighbors requires focus. It requires dedication. It requires practice. And so may God, our loving God, increase in us faith, hope, and love, remembering that the greatest of these is love. Amen.